Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Urban League of Louisiana's 2022 Empowerment and Policy Conference. I'm Judy Reese Morse, and I have the honor of serving as the president and CEO of this historic organization that has been serving the state of Louisiana since 1938. We've got an amazing conversation just in front of you. And so I hope you have your notebook and your pens. I hope you have your computers. I hope you're ready to take notes because we've got some of the country's leading thinkers on closing the racial wealth gap on this panel, and you won't want to miss one word of what they have to say. In 2021, the Urban League of Louisiana launched the Sea Change Collective. It's a long-term collective impact initiative to close the racial wealth gap for the greater New Orleans region and ultimately for the state of Louisiana. We launched this effort in part because of the $3 billion in economic output in the Metro New Orleans area. And that's what the Metro New Orleans area stands to gain by the year 2050 if we are able to close the racial equity gap. The racial wealth gap persists due to accumulated inequality, discrimination, and policy. This is what we talk about at the Urban League of Louisiana every day. But the good news is it can be addressed. I am joined today by members of the Sea Change National Advisory Committee who are going to speak to the opportunity for wealth creation in Black and Brown communities, from entrepreneurship and homeownership to strategies rooted in community. I'd like to introduce our panel, our esteemed panel, I might add, and then we'll get into the questions. Starting with Angela Glover Blackwell, Bill Bynum, Peggy Davis, Dr. Andre Perry, and Dr. Janae Queen Nazaire. They are each going to tell you a little bit about who they are and what they do, and then we'll start with this very, very important conversation. I want to say before we get started that the Urban League of Louisiana does an annual statewide listen and learn tour. We travel to 7 cities across the state of Louisiana, and I love this tour because we have an opportunity to engage members of the communities that we serve. We spend 2, 3, sometimes almost 4 hours in some really exciting and engaging conversations. And that is what we take and use to inform a lot of the work that we do, whether it's this policy conference, whether it's the Urban League's policy agenda. The number one issue that we heard from people across the state of Louisiana for the last 2 years is closing the racial wealth gap. So this issue is critical. It is critical to the advancement of African Americans in the state of Louisiana. And that's why we are so honored that each of you have agreed to serve on the National Advisory Committee for the Urban League of Louisiana's Sea Change Initiative. So I'd like to start with someone who I admire deeply. I have a nickname for her. It's not just mine. Many of us call her the notorious AGB. You don't know Angela Glover Blackwell, you really have been living under a rock. So come out from under your rock and go and learn about this incredible, incredible national leader. Angela, welcome to the panel. And please tell us a little bit about who you are, your background, and then I have a couple of questions for you to get us started.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm Angela Glover Blackwell, and I'm the founder and resident of PolicyLink, an organization that I founded 23 years ago to advance racial and economic equity. Our motto is lifting up what works because we are so convinced that the wisdom to be able to create a more equitable society exists in the communities all across this country. So my pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Angela. So you and PolicyLink have engaged in a tremendous amount of research related to the wealth gap. And if anyone were to search your name and racial wealth gap, you would find a keynote address that you gave on this very topic in the year 2011. Can you help set the stage for us nationally about what this racial wealth gap is all about?
Oh, absolutely. And I'm so pleased that you're focused on it because it is essential to be able to build a truly equitable society. And with so many issues creating, sustaining, and recreating racial inequality in America, often this issue of the racial wealth gap doesn't get the focus it deserves. After all, we have an education gap and a health gap and a housing gap and a democratic participation gap, you name it. If there's something that is there to help people be able to reach their full potential, the Black community has a very difficult time being able to access it. And that has spilled over into the Latinx community and all communities that are struggling to participate. It's hard. It's hard to address the racial wealth gap because it is the manifestation of so much inequality, so much oppression, so much deliberate placing people of color, Black people in particular, at a disadvantage. It is important to talk about a history that many people want to run away from. And I wish we could just sweep it under the rug, but we can't because we're living with the impact of it every day. This is a country founded on genocide for the purpose of stealing land, founded on human bondage for the purpose of slave labor, and then continued in every way imaginable through laws, through custom, through evil strategy to be able to keep people who had been disadvantaged from the first beginning in a state of disadvantage. And so being able to overcome this is really hard. And it requires going back and analyzing that history, because what it means not to have gotten the 40 acres, what it means not to have been able to accumulate wealth through home ownership or business development, what it means not to have had access to have the money to invest in the stock market and start small businesses. It means that so many people in the Black community and the Latinx community do not have what it requires to be able to pursue higher education for yourself or your children, do not have what is needed to be able to take care of your wealth in terms of your health, in terms of being able to step back when you realize you're in a stressful situation, to be able to pay for preventive health care, to be able to live in places where you have access to a safe environment, fresh fruits and vegetables, and safe places to be able to exercise. It means that what it takes to be able to have that kind of security that reduces mental stress is not available to people. And so it's a big issue. Without wealth, those things are very hard. All too often, though, we have a simplistic notion once we realize there's a wealth gap about how to deal with it. And we place the burden on the very people who have been placed in the position because of structures not to have access to wealth that they need. The common cry is just get a good education. If you just get a good education, you could overcome the wealth problems. Well, the data show that people who are Black with education are not able to overcome the wealth gap, that it exists at every level of education. In fact, a Black family that with a college educated head of household has less wealth than a white family whose head of household has no high school diploma. And it doesn't stop just once you move from there. White households with a bachelor's degree or a post education have 3 times the wealth of Black families with the same education. So just pursuing education is not going to solve the problem. People say, well, why don't you just save up, get a small home, move up, get a bigger home, take the equity out of your home. Isn't that how you build wealth? Well, no, not if you're Black. White home-owning households have nearly 140,000 more net worth than comparable Black families that own a home. And then there's always that thing of, well, you know, the American way, the capitalist way, is to start a small business. People of color, including people who are Black, start businesses at 3 times the rate of people who are white. And yet, their businesses are small and under-resourced. White business owners start their business with an average of $106,000, Black ones with an average of $35,000. And this is a shocking piece of information. Over 90% of Latinx and Black firms and close to 98% of Black women-owned firms have but a single employee, the owner. And then there's the last one that people say, well, if you just didn't go out and spend your money in such a frivolous way, if you would just save, you could begin to close the wealth gap on your own. We have a situation where once you take into account income, Black families actually have higher saving rates than white counterparts. and they save at equal rates in 401k plans. And yet there is this persistent sense that saving is going to solve the problem. We have been saving forever and it hasn't solved the problem. And so what do we need to do? We need to have big, bold, systemic, structural strategies to be able to close the wealth gap. It is essential as we think about the future of the nation and we think about the fact that people of color are rapidly becoming the majority of those in the nation's very future, the fate of the nation depends on people who are going to be the future, having the wealth, having the income, having the education, having all of those things that allow them to make their full contribution.
Wow, Angela, thank you so much for really getting us started and grounding us in many of the issues and the areas that we need to pay attention to. What I've taken away from what you just said, and there's this thread for me is, if you would just. So I want to come back to that towards the end of this panel. If you would just, and I agree, I have some things that I think that others could do if they would just, but we'll come back to that. Thank you for grounding us there. Turn it over to my good friend, Bill Bynum. Just what an incredible national leader you are. So thrilled to have you as a member of this National Advisory Committee. Bill, tell us a little bit about who you are first, please, and then I have a question for you.
Thank you, Judy. Glad to be here. I'm Bill Bynum. I am the CEO of HOPE. That's a nonprofit loan fund, community development intermediary, a HOPE credit union, and HOPE Policy Institute. And together we exist to try to make sure that where one lives, their race, their gender, who their parents were, do not limit their ability to support their families and to contribute to their local economy. And our primary tool for doing that is financial resources. But again, that's a tool. The objective is to level the playing field so that, as Angela so eloquently described, opportunity is not limited to just a few based on things that they can't control.
Absolutely. So my first question for you, Bill, is focused on banking. We know it's an important component in addressing the wealth gap, as you just said, especially considering your work across the South. What do you wish you saw more of from banking that you believe could help to close the racial wealth gap?
No, it's interesting, Judy, as I mentioned, it's at some point, whether it's health, education, homes, jobs, a grocery store, getting access to healthy food, at some point capital is necessary. And so the banking system is a vital player in making sure the opportunity is available, but it is not available to everyone equally. Just level setting in Louisiana, we work in Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Alabama, some of the blackest and poorest parts of this country. And in Louisiana, significant gaps exist between Black and white households in terms of banking. And a quarter of white folks in Louisiana either don't have an account or rely on high cost, often predatory lenders, 25%. 53% of Black families are either unbanked or underbanked. And these play out in every aspect of the banking system. In mortgages, 13% of white folks are denied a loan compared to 30% of Black. In fact, white households earning between $50,000 and $75,000 are more likely to qualify for a mortgage than a Black household that earns over $100,000. So there's systemic discrimination in the system that manifests in homeownership rates that are widely disparate. 74% for white homeowners in Louisiana compared to 47% for Black homeowners. We saw it play out in spades, if you will, during the Paycheck Protection Program when so many mom and pop businesses, Black sole proprietorships were shut out of the program at the beginning. And when it opened up, it were not the big banks that opened the door. It was Black-led, Black-owned community development financial institutions that answered the call. And And that was critically important because so many of those mom and pop businesses are the only employer for people in their neighborhoods, and they're more likely to employ lower skilled people because those are the folks who have not been able to get access to higher education in many cases. And so knowing these gaps, I would really like to see more banks act like they value the communities, the people that they are able to serve because of taxpayers. They benefit from federal insurance, and but for your and my tax dollars, they would not exist. But they do not serve all communities equally. You know, at Hope, 77% of our members are Black. 90% of our mortgages went to people of color, and we are our performance rates are as high or better than most banks. We outperformed some of the major banks during the financial crisis. Same thing, 70% of our small business and commercial loans went to people of color. And we do this because it matters who makes the decisions. It matters who's in the boardroom. It matters from the boardroom to the teleline. 60% of Black-owned financial institutions are more likely to be located in a Black community compared to 6% of non-Black banks and credit unions. So there's, so be more intentional about serving these communities, how you serve them, the policies, the decisions that are made, and develop products that are tailored to meet the needs. It's not as if we have gone belly up serving the communities where we exist. And so it's a matter of will, and I'd like to see more banks demonstrate the courage and the will to do what's right.
Thank you so much, Bill, for helping us to really add some research and data points to what we all, in one way or another, are very, very familiar with. This idea of access to capital, whether you are an individual who's looking for money to purchase a home, or whether or not you're looking for capital to start a business. This idea of being able to access the support that you need in order to advance yourself, to advance your business, and to build that generational wealth that you can pass down is really, really a critical issue. It is what we're talking about today on this panel, Closing the Racial Wealth Gap. It is the work that the Urban League of Louisiana has prioritized, and obviously each of you as national thought leaders and in the work that you're doing. I want to come back to this idea of courage and will. We'll come back to that in just a few minutes. Dr. Andre Perry, welcome.
Yes, well, I'll introduce myself by saying, first of all, thank you for Bill and Angela. You don't know how much I've built upon your work in my life. And I also want to say thank you to the Urban League. As many people know, I was a longtime resident of Louisiana, New Orleans in particular. And it was there in my work and education did I learn that kids don't live in schools, they live in communities. And too often we escape the fact that we need to invest capital in the way people live in their communities and stop blaming schools, stop blaming all these other things. And so that's when I started looking at housing. I started looking at other issues, but I'll stay on housing. Many people know me from my housing devaluation work, where we compared homes in Black neighborhoods where the share of the Black population is greater than 50%, and looked at the home prices there compared to their counterparts where the share of the Black population is less than 1%. And homes are on average valued half as much, but a lot of people will say that's because of education, that's because of crime. But those are things you can control for in a study, and that's what we did. We control for education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics. And what we found is that homes in Black neighborhoods are underpriced by 23%, about $48,000 per home. Cumulatively, that's about 156 billion in lost equity, 156 billion. I just want to put that in the context. 156 billion would have financed more than 4 million Black-owned businesses based upon that average amount Black people use to start up their firms. It would have paid for more than 8 million four-year degrees based upon the average amount of a four-year public education. Replaced the pipes in Flint, Michigan 3,000 times over. It would have covered nearly all of Hurricane Katrina damage, and it's about double the annual economic burden of the opioid crisis. And this is why I say, until like it's keeping my teeth white, that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve. When things go wrong in Black communities, we blame people. And it gets to the prior panelist conversation, and I say it this way: Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese philosopher who died recently, used to say, if you're growing a head of lettuce and the lettuce isn't growing, you don't blame the lettuce. You look to see if the soil's rich. You look to see if it's getting sunlight. You look to see if it's getting rainwater. You never blame the lettuce. But in public policy, we're constantly blaming the lettuce when it comes to Black people. And we don't look at the wealth that is extracted by normal practices every single day. Angela and Bill talked about a few things. I'll just add that we certainly have seen tax policy shift in ways that protects wealth and limits intergenerational wealth transfer in ways that hurts people who don't have wealth. We know that the banking industry limits or denies opportunities, as Bill mentioned. We know that student debt, the rise of student debt was paralleled the rise of Black and brown people going to college. We see medical debt really limiting Black economic mobility. Business development, as was mentioned, when you have less equity in homes, you have less businesses. In fact, if the Black population is about 14% in the US, but we represent only 2% of employer firms with more than one employee. If Black businesses equal the Black population, we would have 800,000 more businesses, 800,000, trillions of dollars added to the economy. In that regard, equity is stimulus. And so for me, this wealth issue is, it's an indicator. It's still just an indicator, right? It's an important one, no question about it, but it's really an indicator of power in this country and who has it and who does not. And for me, while I work on the wealth divide, what I'm really working on is empowering Black and brown people so that policy works for us and not against us. So again, I want to thank you and all the panelists for this important conversation. And my heart will always be in Louisiana. And so I'm very happy to be here.
Andre, let me just say a few words about you and the work that you left for us who are still here in Louisiana. I know you and your beautiful family and your wife Joya travel to Louisiana as often as possible, but there's no doubt that your work really added to the foundation of these kinds of issues, the work that the Urban League, the NAACP, and other civil rights organizations are doing every day. So I just want to take this moment to thank you for that. And also thank you, and this would be true for everyone on this panel, thank you for always accepting the call when the Urban League makes it. It's so important to show up for one another as we're all doing this work from our different vantage points. This is heavy lifting work. This is not child's play. And it only matters and it only works when we support one another. And you are always there to say yes when we call on you. And so I wanna just thank you for that. I'll come back to you. I have a few more questions that I think you'll want to speak to. I want to go next to Dr. Janae Queen Nazaire. Janae, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the amazing work that you are doing.
Yes, thanks everyone. So happy to just be on this panel with you all. I am a senior advisor for Providence Strategic Growth, a private equity firm that focuses on purchasing software businesses, no matter the industry. And the thing that I love about being connected to that work is that it's about ownership, resources, and power. And so what I do is then I take that into all of my other lives, where I also serve as a senior fellow at PolicyLink, where we're working really hard to figure out how to get the 100 million who are at or below the 200% federal poverty level. We got to get them out of that. And so what are the systems changes that are necessary to make, to strengthen our economy, close these gaps, and sort of be the America that we can reimagine for ourselves?
Here's a question for you. Through your work with Living Cities and in your own efforts, you have worked with a number of innovative approaches to deploy public and private capital for investing in people of color. Tell us about some of the top solutions that you're seeing for addressing the racial wealth gap at this time.
For sure. I want to first, Judy, just ask everyone, are we okay with Black people actually being wealthy? Will we allow it to happen? Is it something that we can actually achieve as a society? Like, that belief is really, really, it's critical to our work, because there's no easy answer, because we're solving 500-year-old problems, not 50-year-old problems. The persistent disinvestment, and we've heard about it already from others, but the persistent disinvestment and structural exclusion of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are why these problems exist in the first place. Citi released a report recently stating that had we solved racially driven economic inequality at the turn of the century, we could have seen $16 trillion gained over the past 20 years in our GDP. Imagine how tremendously helpful and beneficial that would have been as we entered into this pandemic. But we have allowed ourselves to be okay with subjugating humans for far too long. So I think we, individual people, organizations, institutions who collectively make up these systems, we got to keep it real about perpetuating the disparities, which is why, of course, I'm glad we're here having this conversation. One solution is we need to get back to our humanity. The untangling of centuries-old problems require not only a set of programs and strategies, but also a paradigm shift in our beliefs, our behaviors, our power structures, and our relationships to Black and Brown people, and in our relationship to what it means to be wealthy and well. We must decide that we are okay with Black people being wealthy. And when we get this conviction in our bodies, the systems will shift. So that's one solution. That paradigm shift is really necessary. Another solution, you heard Angela talk about business growth as a key part of closing the racial wealth gap. And so one path to reversing trends that we often see for Black and Brown business owners, one path is to focus on the people on the supply side of, or in the supply side of capital. If we can disrupt some stark racial disparities there, we're going to be better off. So general partners, investors, if you will, Black, Brown, Indigenous, and women, GPs, they manage about 1.3% of $69 trillion being managed through hedge funds, real estate, private equity, and even mutual funds. And so what that means is that 98.7% of the capital decision makers are white men. And so we need more Black and Brown people in decision-making seats at existing firms for the funds that are being set up and more. And so there was an uptick post George Floyd. And we saw more capital raised by Black and Latinx GPs, and we saw more dollars going to Black and Brown founders. For example, Black GPs raised $3.2 billion in capital. That was great. And it translated to $900 million in new capital for Black founders in particular. But if you look deeper into the research, the average check size was less than $1 million. And so what this means is that you have several LPs, as few as 20 and as many as 100, which is problematic, because then it's a much heavier burden to bear when you're trying to get to market, when you're trying to get dollars out the door to businesses. You've got to pay for legal and accounting and there's just all of these expenses, time, financial infrastructure that these investors have to take on. And it's not necessarily helpful. So it's a start to get more resources in the hands of the funders, but they need bigger checks as well. And I'd say one other solution to note is about processes in the supply side of capital. And New Orleans, quite frankly, is a great example. When I was with Living City some years ago, we partnered with the Landry administration and some other community partners to leverage the $2 billion post-Katrina infrastructure resources. And we found that it was challenging for local and smaller businesses to capitalize on the opportunities to rebuild their city. So in partnership, we designed a strategy to increase the flow of procurement capital to these businesses so that the subcontractors would have support completing their projects, getting paid on time, covering employee payroll, and not getting held up in the process. There was also technical assistance provided and on-site support for projects to guarantee success all around. We effectively designed the process to produce outcomes that benefited everyone, businesses, cities, and the community. And what's exciting is this work is being taken to the next level under the Cantrell administration, where they're working to unbundle contracts as a key strategy to increasing contracting opportunities for local businesses that often have to get in line after bigger prime contracts. So this was all possible because the people of New Orleans, they valued Black lives and they centered Black wealth and well-being. And therefore the strategies, the resources, and the capital were structured to invest in these people and systems.
Thank you so much, Janae. And again, I'm hearing this theme of courage and will, humanity. Do we want everyone to have an opportunity to be successful? Do we want everyone to have an opportunity to thrive? Everyone's family to have an opportunity to grow and to then pass on that growth and that wealth to the next generation so that we are building those generational wealth opportunities. I think we all know the answer to those questions, but they are important questions to raise. And some might say, don't be silly. Why ask such silly questions? We all know that these questions, unfortunately, must be asked. And that is why we are focusing on this issue with a laser-like focus at the Urban League of Louisiana. And so I want to go to the last, but certainly not least, panelist, Peggy Davis, who is with the Chicago Community Trust. And Peggy, I must give credit where credit is due. For those who are just learning about Sea Change, which is our generational wealth, racial wealth gap closing initiative at the Urban League of Louisiana, the inspiration for us taking this on, using a collective impact model to really focus on this issue and to build out a multi-year strategic framework that focuses on wages and income, home ownership, and business ownership actually was inspired by work that your organization, the Chicago Community Trust, is doing. So I'd love for you, Peggy, to say a little bit about what you do at Chicago Community Trust, and then tell us a little bit about your work there.
Thank you, Judy. First of all, thanks to the Urban League. I'm adding my thanks to what everyone has said about appreciating this opportunity to be with you and this amazing panel of speakers to speak about this work. So the Chicago Community Trust, for those of you who don't know, is the Regions Community Foundation. So we focus on Chicago, Cook County, and some surrounding collar counties. We've been around for over 100 years, and we focus on the region's greatest needs. And just referencing something that Angela said at the top, you know, when she talked about all of the indicators of well-being where there is disparity. And as a community foundation, that used to be our focus, right? We had portfolios of work on health. We had portfolios of work on education. In 2019, when we launched the strategy, it was the realization that at the root cause of all of that disparity was economic inequality that is based on race. And so by being more targeted in our approach in addressing the wealth gap, we could continue to address all the disparities that we had been trying to address for a very long time. So as I said, we launched the strategy in 2019. Judy, as you said, it is a collective strategy. It is a long-term strategy, and it is not for the faint of heart. And when we undertook this, it was a big change for the trust. It was a big change at the time, although you would not know that today, to talk about race inequality. People were not using that terminology as freely as they did today. And so we were being cautious in our approach when we launched it in the fall of 2019. The silver lining to the pandemic that happened the year after that is that it exacerbated and illustrated all of the disparities that were part of our strategy. But it brought it to light, put it in the daily newspaper so that more folks were talking about it, more folks were focused on it. And so in some ways it reinforced what we had undertaken. It reinforced our belief that it was the right way to go. So in terms of, what our experience has been, so we're in year 3. What our experience has been in implementing the strategies that you've heard others talk about this morning, addressing strategies that build wealth at the household level, at the neighborhood level, and at the community level. And I won't go through them because they've already been discussed. I would say there are a few things that to keep in mind, right? And Judy, you said a couple of them, right? It's a long-term strategy. It's a collective strategy. So managing partnerships is a critical component of what must be done in order to make this successful. So in addition to deciding what strategic levers you're going to push, it's determining who your key partners are and what role they're going to play over the short or the long term. Some partners are short term and it's about resources. Other partners are going to help you drive the kind of change you're seeking. So identifying who those actors are and maintaining the partnerships over time. And there are the necessary partnerships with the public sector, right, that you have to manage throughout this. What are the levers that you can push with them versus others? And so being in a position to take those opportunities as they arise, which leads to the second thing that I want to talk about, and that's flexibility, right? We know the world is changing, barriers and opportunities come and go. As I said, the pandemic for us had that silver lining of exacerbating the inequities that we were trying to address. And so it is being flexible enough in the strategy to be able to respond to both the challenges and the opportunities that are going to come our way over this long term, at least 10 years that we plan to address the strategy. And then we know, we've already talked about this, policy and systems change is a glue to all of this. That's why you're having this conference. That's why we're focused on policy. People like to say we're not going to program our way out of the challenges that have existed for decades. We have to focus on policy and systems change. Those are the things that withstand things like changes in political administrations. So that's what I would say are the key learnings from our strategies and from the work that we've been doing for the last 3 years. It's also exhausting. You said that too, Judy. It is hard work. It is exhausting, and you have to stick to it and have partners that are going to stick with you along the way.
Absolutely, Peggy. Thank you so much for those words. Really, approach really matters. An approach, a strategy, a process. They're not sexy, but they are really critical to any big long-term effort. And that is what we think we've put together at the Urban League to really focus on getting this model right. We believe if we can do it in the greater New Orleans area, we can then take that to other parts of Louisiana. And I know that the National Urban League focuses in on this issue. And so then how does that spread through the National Urban League to affiliates across the country? There is a big vision around this work because it is so critical. It's such a fundamental piece of this larger puzzle of all of these pieces that are rooted in institutional racism that we've got to break up and then figure out and work together to build a foundation to move forward. I do want to go back to the idea of policy, though. This is an Empowerment and Policy Conference. Are there any other policy levers that we haven't mentioned that anyone, and this is open to anyone on the panel, that we should be thinking about, that we should be focusing in on so that we don't miss the opportunity to share with our conference attendees?
I'm happy to start with a few. And I'll be quick. I want to start with a few. One is we really need an atmosphere in which all government entities are leaning in to think about what they can do. I think that we really need to keep lifting up reparations, to talk about that history, because we need to be thinking about what we're doing within the context of reparations. Starts with an apology, but is a lot more than that to be able to really repair and move forward. I also think there's some good ideas that we've seen, and it's a shame that we're letting it go. The child tax credit is extraordinary. Cut child poverty in half. We really need to have guaranteed income. We need direct cash. And even though that's not necessarily going to build the wealth that we're talking about, it creates a floor so people aren't constantly trying to catch up. That we need to be thinking long-term. Baby bonds, Derek Hamilton and the work that he's been doing, really pushing baby bonds, absolutely essential. From the time a baby comes here, Black babies, brown babies, they need to begin to build the wealth that they will need. So when they become of age, they actually are not starting below zero. I also think that we need to take seriously this notion that the future of the nation, the fate of the nation, is dependent on finally getting right what we have never gotten right. And that is for people of color to have access to true opportunity. The equity agenda really is the not just a moral imperative, but a national imperative and an economic imperative. Equity is the superior growth model. We need the equivalent of a Marshall Plan focused on those people who are going to be the future, to be able to focus in every way that we can through government. And as we're talking about government, let's not forget about the private sector. Bill talked about banks. He talked about what they can do, but we know what they have done. They have been outrageous. Banks were underwriters of slavery. Banks actually kept Black people from accumulating wealth as they were moving to cities during the Great Migration. Banks have withheld the capital that would be needed. And so we need the banks to step up and lead the reparations fight from the private sector, eliminating student debt, eliminating interest for mortgages, eliminating interest for loans to start small business for Black people. It sounds outrageous, but the way we got here was from banks and others being outrageous in the bad that they did. Now they need to be outrageous on the good side.
Thank you, Angela.
I feel like I could just say amen when Angela speaks.
I do too.
I mean, it is so true. I mean, it's not a year in the past 50 years when banks have not made more money at the end of the year than they made the prior year. So, through Katrina, through the financial crisis, during the pandemic, banks were incredibly profitable, but those profits do not go back into the communities. The Community Reinvestment Act is up for consideration now. And I think that is just one example of how we have to hold these entities, these people who control power and wealth that affects the lives of the communities we're talking about, holding them accountable. It's not just banks, it's corporations. It's great when you have a Judy Reese-Moore sitting in the city government, but that's not always going to be the case. And in the Deep South, we know that the state policymakers don't have a great history of prioritizing communities and people of color. So with billions, trillions of dollars going into the economy, billions into municipalities, we've got to think about how we inject accountability into how these dollars are going to be used. As you're talking about rebuilding infrastructure, okay, which communities are going to be at the front of the lines and which ones are not going to be in line? Who are going to get the contracts to do the work that's necessary? Because if we do not make sure that some of these resources, these billions and trillions of dollars, go to the Black and brown and diverse entrepreneurs and contractors, then the gaps are only going to get wider. We can't continue to be trickled on. We've got to hold these policymakers, banks, and others accountable, and that's harder to do, as we know. The courts are not increasingly, not reliable in terms of some of the laws, fair housing, Community Reinvestment Act that we thought and we could take for granted. Those are not given. One thing that I will mention, though, is when you're a business owner, when you have a banking account, when you own a home, you're more likely to stand up and be counted. You have a stake in the game. You're going to go to your city council. 90% of Hope Credit Union members voted in the last 2 elections. And so to Andre's point, this is about power. When you own, you exert your power, and that's not going to be given up very easily. But we have to stand up and take that power and put it to use. Judy, I'm so glad that you are having these conversations, because we need to make people aware of the opportunities, but these opportunities are not going to just materialize out of thin air. We're going to have to step up and make them happen.
Thank you, Bill. And I want to just mention something because it's still playing in my head. We were talking recently, and you talked about the sense of urgency. Say a little bit about why this work has to move forward right now.
I mean, we all know how the world seemed to change after George Floyd. The Business Roundtable talked about the purpose of an economy, of corporations, an economy that works for all. That's great, but when you ask them how that applies in Central City, in New Orleans, in the Alabama Black Belt, in the Mississippi Delta, you don't get a straightforward answer. And it was interesting, we saw polls that not long after Floyd, people acknowledged that systemic discrimination in institutions was a problem and needed attention. But it didn't take long for the wolf whistles and the narrative to change, and policymakers back away from being intentional. But I do think that, quite honestly, there are some corporations who aren't running for election this year. They know that their future workforce, their future customers are increasingly Black and brown. They may take the longer view, and so I think we have a moment to leverage. And so, but that moment is fleeting. We've already seen how easily they get distracted, and we know with Ukraine, with inflation, there are going to be other things. Before we know it, it'll be George Floyd who. So we've got to move while the crack in the door is there.
Andre, Peggy, and Janae, I'd love to get your perspective on what you would like to see come from the Sea Change initiative, and whether it's the Sea Change initiative in Louisiana or any other similar initiative happening anywhere in the country. What does success look like for you as it relates to work that's being done on the ground?
Well, I'll say this, when people talk about New Orleans in particular, they say it's a tourism city. Let's be real, this is an oil and gas city, and there is wealth in the area, and they are not contributing to the well-being of citizens of the state. And that is by design. And so in addition, I think I would like to see some innovations rooted in New Orleans. We need new credit scoring systems. I mean, there's things like this that if we can experiment at a local level, they could work their way up to the national level. People always think that redlining, for instance, started at the White House or the federal government. Actually, people point to Baltimore in 1910, but there were all these sort of redlining type of activities at the local level. They were then codified and resourced at the national level, but these exclusionary policies worked their way up to the White House. We need reparative policies to occur at the local level, and that's why we can't say reparations enough. And there's disagreement, in this conversation. Can you have local reparations? Some, Sandy Darity and others, do not believe that you can. I believe that you can have reparations at the local level because local governments wildly discriminated against Black people, and there is a debt owed in that regard. And you're seeing cities all over the country create funds in many different ways. And this is, again, where corporations of oil and gas need to step up. We need reparations funds so Mayor Cantrell can provide the kind of resources for affordable housing policies, so Bill Bynum can resource some of the things that they're doing. There's resources there in Louisiana. I mean, but there is such exclusionary policies there. And quite frankly, a meanness. You know, I lived in New Orleans for 16 years. It was one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen, but it was also the most meanest places I've ever seen when it comes to Black people. And so for me, I think what I would like to see is local efforts that may not change the wealth gap overnight, but it may lead to some type of movement towards the national level. More importantly, it encourages a culture, a reparative culture that we all desperately need. So doing all these things at a local level, making New Orleans the epicenter, because you know, when we went through Katrina, a few years later, the nation forgot. Same thing in Minneapolis. You know, major things happen. A few years later, they're not part of the conversation. We got to figure out the way to concretize movements, and that's for me is doing structural change at the local level and making it work its way up.
Thank you,
Can I just
Andre.
endorse that? I'd love to endorse what Andre just said, because you took the words right out of my mouth when we were talking about policy. There is some policy change that is local and important. You talk about reparations. There are other things like predatory lending here was a big lever. And we had an opportunity to support legislation reducing the cap on interest rates from 400%, which is outrageous, to 35%, which is still outrageous, but less outrageous. So I do believe that those local efforts are so important, and then building on them so that they reach, you know, the national level. But I just want to say, sometimes these issues, even though the racial wealth gap is a national phenomenon in cities, there are peculiarities that are local that we can address at the local level and bring about some change.
Thank you, Peggy. So we have about 2 minutes left, and there are two things that I want to do. I want to hear from Janae to this point, and then I've got one final question. And I think we can get it done so that we can stay on track, and we don't want to be late, because the next panel is the panel of mayors, and it will include Mayor Cantrell from New Orleans, Mayor Sharon Weston Broome from Baton Rouge, and Mayor Jeff Hall from Alexandria, all within the state of Louisiana. So we don't want to miss what they have to offer, because so much of what you have referred to really speaks to your point, Peggy and Andre, and all of you, what can happen in cities. That is what Sea Change is all about. So Janae?
Yeah, so it's been said. So all I'll add is that in my experience, we've seen cities leapfrog states and counties and other efforts. And so they can serve as a bellwether in innovative policies and practices for closing these gaps. I'll add that we need to redefine stakeholder value, and cities have the power to set policies in place to hold private companies accountable for contributing to closing that gap. And then the final thing for Sea Change in cities is that anything that happens, narrative change strategies have to be tethered to any technical solution. We got to change mental models.
Thank you. I'm really happy to hear you say that as a member of our National Advisory Committee for Sea Change, because there is a narrative change component that is built into the work that we're doing. So thank you for that. Final question. I hate to end this conversation. This is incredible. I knew it would be, but here's my final question. And it really comes from how Angela started us off. If they would just, I want each of you to finish that sentence. If they would just, let's go with you, Janae. You want to go first?
Who's the they?
The they can be whoever you wish the they to be.
Value Black lives and believe that we can be wealthy.
Thank
then
you.
We're going to see gaps closed and a future that we can all be proud of.
Thank you. Thank you. Andre.
If they would just provide at least $40,000 of down payment assistance to every Black resident or low wealth resident in New Orleans, it will go a long way.
Thank you, sir. Peggy.
If they would just let go of the notion that this is a zero-sum game proposition, that increasing wealth for Black people is good for everyone.
Thank you, Peggy.
Mhm.
Mr. Bynum.
Well, Andre, if 145,000 Black Louisianans became homeowners, the Black wealth gap would go away and take investment, down payment assistance. So if they would just close the homeownership gap.
Thank you. Let's end with whom we started, the notorious AGB, Angela, if they would just.
If so many white people would just stop being nostalgic for a time that never was and embrace a future that is inevitable, which is a nation that is dependent on what happens to people of color who have been disproportionately left behind, we could finally lean into the full potential of the nation if we would just make the investment in the future, because that is the only investment worth making.
Well, that is an amazing way to end this amazing conversation. Thank you to each of you, the members of the National Advisory Committee for the Sea Change Collective, work being done at the Urban League of Louisiana. We invite everyone, no matter where you are in the state, because if you're not in the greater New Orleans area, this work is coming to your part of the state, I promise. Please go to our website to learn more about Sea Change. Thank you to this National Advisory Committee. Thank you to everyone who has made Sea Change possible to date, all of our funders, and thank all of you for attending this conference, but it's not over. We've got a great panel discussion with some of the leading mayors in the state of Louisiana. We hope you stay with us. Thank you so much, everyone.